Christmas Carol. The story was written 156 years ago in 1843. Dickens completed the book in just under 6 weeks. He got the idea for the story after visiting the northern industrial town in England of Manchester, where he had given a speech on the necessity of educating poor children. Dickens wrote the book because he needed money, but he chose the theme in response to the notorious poverty of what was then called the Hungry Forties. A week after its publication, the book had sold over 6,000 copies. A Christmas Carol was Dickens' favorite, and he used it for his first public reading. In the beginning, the readings were for the benefit of charities, but after a few years of sold-out houses, he decided to go professional. Dickens was so successful that his rival, William Thackeray, said, "Dickens could have earned £20,000 a year if he had gone on stage." A tidy sum in those days. The first readings took over 3 hours, but Dickens eventually edited the story down to 80 minutes, and this edited version is the one you'll hear tonight. Here's what the London Leader newspaper wrote after Dickens' first public reading of A Christmas Carol in 1857. "We have rarely witnessed or shared an evening of such genuine enjoyment. Never before remember to have seen a crowded assembly of over 3,000 people hanging for upwards to 2 hours on the lips of a single reader. Every fragment of dialogue was treated dramatically, and at the close there was an outburst, not so much of applause, as downright hurrahing from every part of the hall." And now it is my pleasure to introduce the Voices of Joy Choir. This unique choir brings together people of all abilities. The choir is sponsored by the Newmarket and District Association for Community Living and is under the direction of their founder, Linda Middlebrook. They're going to sing Songs of Joy, the Voices of Joy Choir.
Every nation sings songs of
The idea for a dramatic reading of A Christmas Carol began with 4 children, a book, and an idea. Judy Madrin, a broadcaster with CBC Radio, sat down one evening during the Christmas season to read the story to her 4 children. It took 3 nights, but she was amazed to find that all her children paid rapt attention to the story while she read. In fact, her husband, who'd agreed to wash the dishes after dinner, kept sneaking into the room to listen. Judy felt that adults rarely had the opportunity to be read to, and that they might enjoy listening to the story too. So she spoke to some colleagues of CBC Radio and found that they were interested in helping her read the story to raise money for a charity. She booked a choir, a local church, a lighting specialist, and she borrowed some equipment from CBC Radio. Her family and friends sold tickets, and on December 7, 1990, 400 people arrived at Christ Church Deer Park in Toronto to hear a dramatic reading of A Christmas Carol with music. What started out as a one-shot deal became an annual event, and over the past few years, a coast-to-coast happening as various CBC radio stations and community organizations across Canada started readings to raise money for charity. Last year, there were over 50 readings throughout Canada, and this year, there will be over 70 readings, including this one here in Newmarket. So you're all part of a coast-to-coast happening. CBC Radio supplies the scripts, the production notes, and the CBC personalities. There are now so many requests for readings that the CBC Radio had to second an individual to help Judy Madrin during the reading season. We take this opportunity to thank Judy Madrin, CBC Radio 1, for their production assistance and reports. And now the readers for this evening's performance. Returning for a second year are Roy Green, Cliff Copeland, Norm Dines, Judy Monroe, Maureen Brosnahan, a reporter with CBC National Radio, and this year we're joined by another CBC radio personality whose parents are members of our choir. We welcome Dave Stevens, host of CBC Radio's Ontario Today, back to his hometown of Newmarket. And now on to the show. Please join me in welcoming the Trinity United Church Choir under the direction of Barbara Hallam Price.
So Marley was dead, to begin with. There was no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead? Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, his sole mourner. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name, however. There it yet stood, years afterwards, above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley. He answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, was Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say, with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind man's dog appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master." But what did Scrooge care? Once upon a time of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting, foggy weather, and the city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room. And so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation Scrooge had of his approach.
"Bah, humbug!"
"Christmas a humbug, Uncle? You don't mean that, I'm sure."
"I do. Out upon Merry Christmas. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer. A time for balancing your books and having every item in them through a round dozen of months presented dead against you? If I had my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should."
"Uncle!"
"Nephew, keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine."
"Keep it, but you don't keep it."
"Let me alone then. Much good it may do you, much good it has ever done you."
"There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say, Christmas among the rest. But I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time when it has come round, apart from the veneration due to its sacred origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year, when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow travelers to the grave and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good and will do me good, and I say God bless it." The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded.
Let me hear another sound from you, and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir. I wonder you don't go into Parliament.
Don't be angry, Uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow. Scrooge said that he would see him. Yes, indeed, he did. He went the whole length of the expression and said that he would see him in that extremity first. But why? Cried Scrooge's nephew. Why?
Why did you get married?
Because I fell in love.
Because you fell in love. Good afternoon.
Nay, Uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened. Why give it as a reason for not coming now?
Good afternoon.
I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends?
Good afternoon.
I am sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute. We have never had any quarrel to which I have been a party, but I have made the trial in homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humor to the last. So a Merry Christmas, Uncle.
Oh, good afternoon.
And a Happy New Year.
Good afternoon.
His nephew left the room without an angry word notwithstanding. The clerk, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let two other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands and bowed to him. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?"
Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years. He died 7 years ago this very night.
"At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, taking up a pen, "it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comfort, sir."
Are there no prisons?
"Plenty of prisons, but under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the unoffending multitude, a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?"
Nothing.
"You wish to be anonymous?"
I wish to be left alone. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, this is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the prisons and the workhouses. They cost enough. And those who are badly off must go there.
"Many can't go there, and many would rather die."
If they would rather die, then they had better do it and decrease the surplus population.
At length, the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge, dismounting from his stool, tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat.
Oh, you'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose.
"If quite convenient, sir."
Well, it's not convenient, and it's not fair. If I was to stop a half a crown for it, you'd think yourself mightily ill-used, I'll be bound.
"Yes, sir."
And yet you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wage for no work.
"It's only once a year, sir."
A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier next morning.
The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, went down a slide at the end of a lane of boys 20 times in honor of its being Christmas Eve, and then ran home as hard as he could pelt to play at Blind Man's Buff.
The angel Gabriel from heaven came, his wings as drifted snow, his eyes as flame. All hail, said he, thou lowly maiden Mary, most highly favored lady, Gloria. Known a blessed mother thou shalt be, all generations laud and honor thee. Thy son shall be Emmanuel, thy seers foretold, most highly favored lady, Gloria. it pleases God, she said. My soul shall laud and magnify his holy name. Most highly favored lady, Gloria. Of her Emmanuel the Christ was born in Bethlehem along a Christmas morn. And Christian folk throughout the world will ever say, most highly favored lady, Gloria.
Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's books, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in a lowering pile of building up a yard. The building was old enough now, and had dreary enough, for no one lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door of this house, except that it was very large. Also, that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place. Also, that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London. And yet Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker Marley's face. Marley's face, with a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but it looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. He said, "Puh, puh." He closed the door with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door, walked across the hall, and up the stairs. Slowly, too, trimming his candle as he went. Up Scrooge went, not carrying a button for it being very dark. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, a small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of gruel, Scrooge had a cold in his head, upon the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in, double-locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before the very low fire to take his gruel. As he threw back his head in his chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room, and communicated for some purpose, now forgotten, with the chamber of the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. Soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This was succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. It came on through the heavy door, and a specter passed into his room before his eyes. And upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost." That same face, the very same, Marley in his pigtail, usual wainscoat, tights, and boots. His body was transparent so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on the coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he'd never believed it until now. No, nor did he even believe it now. Though he looked the phantom through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and noticed the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, he was still incredulous.
How now? What do you want with me?
Much.
Well, who are you?
Ask me who I was.
Well, who were you then?
In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley.
Can you sit down?
I can.
Well, do it then.
Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair. But the ghost sat down opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. You don't believe me.
I don't.
What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?
I don't know.
Why do you doubt your senses?
Because a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You might be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of butter, a crumb of cheese, or a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are.
Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his horror. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round its head as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast.
Mercy! Dreadful apparition! Why do you trouble me? Why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?
It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide, and if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. I cannot tell you all I would. A very little more is permitted of me. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger any more. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me! And in life my spirit never roved beyond that narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me.
7 years dead? And traveling all the time? You travel fast.
On the wings of the wind.
You might have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years.
Oh, blind, blind man, not to know that any spirit working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life's opportunities misused. Yet I was like this man. I once was this man.
But you always were a good man of business, Jacob.
Business. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. It held up its chain at arm's length as if it were the cause of its unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again. At this time of the rolling year I suffer most.